You know, there's this joke of my rabbi's so brilliant, he can talk about anything for an hour. And the other guy says, my rabbi's so brilliant, he can talk about nothing for 2 hours.
Rabbi Steven Leder is Rabbi Emeritus of Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles. Founded in 1862, it's the oldest Jewish congregation in Los Angeles. In this unique episode of the Maggid Method, Rabbi Leder, who's been serving the congregation since 1987, shares his non-Orthodox perspective on preaching from the pulpit. Non-Orthodox in the sense that he was educated, served, and taught homiletics within the Reform movement, but also non-Orthodox in the sense that Rabbi Leder is markedly frustrated by the state of affairs he sees in Reform Judaism today.
You can get away with a lot of narishkeit in a Reform shul. You can cut and paste from, Chabad.org or My Jewish Learning. You have a lot more latitude to be imprecise or just plain wrong or sloppy, all of which just annoy me to no end.
In part one of our conversation, Rabbi Leder discusses his earliest influence, a drama teacher in high school who taught him the rare art of writing in order to be heard.
She was the one who saw in me some ability to connect the written and spoken word.
In part two, Rabbi Leder tells a story about the time he discovered that William Safire was present in his audience.
Coming up for the Ilya is William Safire, and I'm thinking in my head, I'm about to give a sermon about the meaning of a word to the New York Times columnist on linguistics and the meaning of words.
And we talk technique, notes, how to choose the right words, even how to use pacing and rhythm for maximum effect.
Sometimes I'll speed up, sometimes I'll slow down, sometimes I'll take it one word at a time.
We talk about digital distractions and why Rabbi Leder thinks the concept of shrinking attention spans is largely a myth.
These are the same people who will binge watch The Sopranos in their cave of a den for hours or days. So I don't really buy the attention span as an issue.
We also cover the topic of how to relate authentically and with genuine empathy to experiences that, as a young rabbi, you may have no frame of reference to relate to.
And you never want to evoke that feeling in the listener. In shul, like, oh, the 27-year-old rabbi is going to tell me about parenting? Shut up.
And lastly, we talk about Rabbi Leder's answer for solving the clergy shortage and how to groom the next generation of rabbinical talent.
There's still 20 rock stars every year coming out of our synagogues in America. Rock stars. We're just not paying attention.
I learned so much from my interview with Rabbi Steven Leder, and I'm sure you will too. So now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Rabbi Steven Leder.
Here we go.
Hey, good morning.
Daniel, how are you?
Good. Thank you so much for making the time.
You're welcome. I care about preaching.
Yeah, that's the topic.
Where are you, by the way?
So I'm in your old stomping grounds in Ohio.
Where?
But I'm in Columbus and not in Cincinnati.
All right, man.
Okay.
Part 1. Connecting the written and spoken word.
So tell me about, even before you started about teaching, where did you learn homiletics from? Where did you begin your speaking career?
Well, I would say my Dvar Torah for my bar mitzvah was certainly one. Because I wrote poetry. I inflicted my 13-year-old poetry on my friends and family. And I was given the latitude to create a Dvar Torah that was essentially an anthology of poetry related to the Parsha, right? So that to me was, wow, there's creative license on the Bima. I mean, that landed even as a 13-year-old, that was possible. And then when I was 14, I had a drama teacher who changed my life in 9th grade. Sandy Marinson, we're still friends today. And wherever I am in the country, if she shows up for a talk, I always ask her to stand and I express my gratitude to her. I mean, she used to drive me from the little suburb I grew up in Minneapolis, to the University of Minnesota to check out plays and read plays, and then we would talk about them. And she was the one who saw in me some ability to connect the written and spoken word. And from reading those plays, I was developing an ability to write to be heard rather than read, which is where most of the young rabbis that I see now and try to help, it's where they fall short. They have clearly been well educated and groomed, and I would even say molded into people who know how to write a paper, an essay, how to give the teacher what the teacher wants, how to do the assignment and to get an A. But they're clueless when it comes to writing to be heard. And a lot of them don't want to write at all. They want to get up and ramble and bullet points and instead of I guess what someone of my era would call a sermon, they want to give a Devar Torah. They want to just ramble. And you have to realize also that in the Reform world, which my shul is actually not a part of, we pulled out of the Reform movement about 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, I would say if you had to group us, we would be conservative Reform or actual conservative.
Yeah.
So in any case, unlike your situation, where people are familiar generally with the text and or don't consider you to be the expert. I mean, they know a few things too. You can get away with a lot of narishkeit in a Reform shul. You can cut and paste from, Chabad.org or My Jewish Learning. You can regurgitate the news as if people can't read themselves. You can give a Devar Torah and throw in a little Hebrew because people don't know Hebrew very much. Very many don't know Hebrew very well. So you have a lot more latitude to be imprecise, or just plain wrong or sloppy, all of which just annoy me to no end. But these are the problems that I've seen. It's why I agreed to teach homiletics in the first place. I think preaching is a lost art. I think people are lazy. They don't prepare. Before you could download, cut, and paste, you really had to think ahead. And you had to know the sources. And you had to be able to find what you were looking for as a proof text or proof texts. And those skills and that depth of knowledge are disappearing in the Reform movement. I can't speak to the conservative movement. I think the knowledge level is still superior. So, and I know I'm tarring everyone with the same brush, but this is what I saw generally over those 13 years of teaching homiletics. And this idea of writing to be read is deoraita, really. If you think about Torah, think about the sentence structure. Very short sentences generally, very stubby, very few multisyllabic words. Simple. Not simplistic, but simple. And that's what I strive for in my writing and my preaching, is to be simple without being simplistic. So I often structure it almost like a song where there's a refrain of some kind. There are people who, let me put it this way, I consider it a victory if, when someone who was at my sermon is asked by someone who wasn't, what did Rabbi Leder talk about this morning? I want them to be able to answer that question in a single word or phrase, because that means I gave them something to carry with them. Now I would hope they would also add, and here's how he illustrated this point, and here was the story, and the Misa, and the this, and the that. but I want them to be able to answer in a word or a phrase, no more than that.
Yeah.
Right. And that too, because you know this so well, that's how rabbis talk to each other. If I walk into a room and I said to you, Higia Zman, I don't have to say more than that. Let's go. Right. So, if I were to say to you, what did the rabbi talk about? I mean, if you and we have this shorthand because we know the entire text to follow, or at least know where to find it and look more. So I really think if you stood out on the steps of the shul and you asked people, what are some of Steve's sermons? They will give you these single word or phrase responses. And this could go back 30, 35 years. Oh, he talked about the difference between a problem and an inconvenience. Oh, he talked about showing up, the importance of showing up, hineni. Oh, he said what was, what is, and that's that. He talked about teshuvah and moving forward. A little is a lot. Oh, he was talking about what a difference we can make. You know, I could go on because I strive for that kind of simplicity.
Yeah. And when you write the sermon, do you write it with that in mind, that someone should be able to that nugget,
yes,
that take?
Because let me tell you, the alternative is, what did your rabbi talk about? Well, he started out, he was talking about something with Moses and Aaron, and then he was talking about the election, and then about Israel. And so what did the rabbi talk about? Nothing in that person's mind. You know, there's this joke of my rabbi's so brilliant, he can talk about anything for an hour. And the other guy says, my rabbi's so brilliant, he can talk about nothing for 2 hours. So there's a lot of that. And I think it's just sloppy. I think that my class, honestly, if I take the evaluation seriously, was the most pragmatic and important for many of the students, excuse me, at HUC.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it was the easiest. Because I expect a lot.
Part 2. Painting with words. Precision at the pulpit.
I noticed also you're really good at rhetoric. You've got a lot of you checked all the boxes. I was looking at one of the sermons. It's there's the contrast. There was this great line. It's sad to say great, but it was the Nazis bringing the Jews to the ovens, and our new enemies bringing the ovens to the Jews. And you have the alliteration and an exceptional exception. You just really check all the boxes. And
the rhythm. Let me just say that I think that is as important. You think about one of your favorite musicians. It's not just the lyrics. It's not just the music. It's the phrasing. It's the rhythm. And that's why, by the way, I write out every word, because I'm treating words like notes of music. And there's a rhythm to the language. And there's a precision to language. There is a difference between gray and pale. There's a difference. It evokes a different image. And so the word choice, the language, the rhythm, it's all part of an oral presentation, a teaching, a telling of a story. And I write out every single word. A lot of the young rabbis don't want to do it. I make them do it so I can see what they're doing and help them, but they don't like it. The reason I write everything down is for what we just discussed. And very often after a sermon, someone will ask for a copy. What are you going to do? Well, I was just kind of making it up as I went along. Or someone will take issue with something they think I said. And I'm able to send it to them and say, if you look carefully, that's not what I said. I
Yeah.
said, I said the intermarried raising Jewish children are my heroes. I didn't say I had an issue with that. So you're able to hold your ground, um, and these are all the reasons why. Plus, then there's a record.
Yeah.
I write out my wedding addresses because people want copies. I write out the eulogy word for word.
Yeah. I was going to say it must have felt great to get some accolades from William Sapphire. Uh,
Well, I'll tell you a funny story about that, which, by the way, I did share with my homiletic students. By the way, the reason I don't teach any longer is when I pulled our congregation out of the URJ, the Reform Movement, they fired me from the seminary, which was just fine with me. I found plenty of good things to do at the time. So what happened was this. We have and he's a friend of mine, family, a Sapphire family at Wilshire Boulevard Temple, but it's spelled Safir. Okay, no E. So we're doing little Zach Sapphire's bar mitzvah, and I'm calling up the Aliyot, and I say, now we call Uncle Bill and Aunt whatever, for the next Aliyah. Uncle Bill walks up, and it's William Sapphire. Now, my drosh, my sermon, it wasn't even a drosh, it was a full-on sermon that morning, was this question about Bedorotov. It's like, was Noah a mensch only by the diminished standards of his own era, or was he objectively a good human being? I thought, I'm going to do a piece about how do you define a good person? What is a mensch? We tell our children all the time, be a mensch, but do we really follow it up with the details? So I wrote essentially a sermon about the meaning of a word. Now, obviously, the Dvar Torah is after Kriyat Torah. So coming up for the Aliyah is William Sapphire, and I'm thinking in my head, I'm about to give a sermon about the meaning of a word to the New York Times columnist on linguistics and the meaning of words. I didn't approach it with fear because I put everything into all of them, and I was prepared, and it was written down, and I was ready to go. So I was seeing it as, wow, this is an opportunity. Now, why do I tell this story to the homiletic students? Because it's a reminder. While you may spend 2% of your time preaching on the Bima, it is 99% of the way you will be judged by the vast majority of your shul, because they aren't going to experience you under the chuppah or at a funeral or at a baby naming or in the hospital. That is their exposure. Obviously, I'm speaking in a Reform context here. So you better be good, because you never know who's out there. And people are intelligent. Never think that you are brighter than the people listening to you. You're not. You're not. Everyone is as smart as you are. You have to operate in the world that way. Everyone is as smart as you are. And so that's originally how I met William Sapphire. He was doing the Aliyah. And then I reached out to him. It turns out that the Sapphire family at the temple, Andy Sapphire, the father of the bar mitzvah, is Bill's nephew. It's Uncle Bill. And that's how the relationship started. And when I wrote my first book, I sent it to him and said, would you mind doing a blurb? He said, well, the New York Times doesn't really like that, but let me read it. So he read it, and he gave me a very generous quote in a column. And, for a young kid with his first book, that was pretty exciting.
Yeah. What I wanted to ask you in terms of, there's talk now about ChatGPT, people using ChatGPT AI to write sermons and things like that. What are your thoughts about that?
It's not art. And I guess, let me ask you, you're really studying this world. Do you think that a Shem Omro is the ethical thing to do if you're using AI to write your sermon? I do. Otherwise, what is it? It's kabuki. It's fake. It's a show. Now, if you want to say, and so I decided to see what AI would say about such a thing and then read it, I'm fine with that. It's an interesting modern example. But it's a regression to the means. And I think it requires full disclosure. Otherwise, it's just plagiarism. You're a phony.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me that you use notes where, you will write everything out and you refer to the notes. But did you ever experiment with trying to speak extemporaneously?
Well, I do that a lot, but not necessarily on the Bima.
Mm-hmm.
And I even do it on the Bima, but not as the Devar Torah. Okay.
Yeah.
But I'm doing little Iyunim all the time on the Bima. I'm standing in front of groups or doing media all the time where nothing is written out or very little is written out. So I do a lot of that. I just approach photography and painting differently, Preaching is painting. It's every brushstroke matters, all the tonality matters, the light matters, the size matters. It all matters in a way that you have more latitude when you're standing in front of a parents' association and they ask you about your recent trip to Israel. I will say it differently than I would write it.
Yeah. And do you rehearse it at all?
I do.
So what's your process for that?
I read it out loud a few times because the rhythm is what's important. So I'll tell you not worst, but vis-a-vis preaching, the two worst feelings I have is when I walk off the bima and I say to myself, I hit the wrong word in that sentence and they didn't quite get what I was hoping for.
Yeah.
Damn, I didn't land it. I didn't land that last line the way I'd hoped to land it. That drives me crazy.
Yeah. You reminded me of Seinfeld where he says sometimes he'll miss a syllable and it'll kill the whole joke.
That's right.
He'll just get a little his like the word will catch in his throat and it'll just tank the joke.
That's right. That's exactly right. And he's the kind of guy, because I know something about how meticulous he is in the construction of his comedy. He'll remember that for years.
Yeah.
So do everything you can to be as great as you can in that one live. It's almost Buberian. It's almost like when you're really in it, you don't even know you're in it. It's so powerful. But the minute you do realize you're in it, you're out of it. I think it was Wordsworth, I'm not positive, said he was talking about literary critics, and he said they murder to dissect. In other words, the moment you start analyzing a poem, you kill it. The minute you start dissecting a piece of art, it's dead. The time for dissection or analytics is before and after, not during. If you really work hard before, you're going to have that transcendent opportunity during, and then you'll learn where you may have fumbled afterwards.
Yeah.
Or someone says, that's a really good sermon, Rabbi. That's really nice. That just infuriates me, because that means it wasn't great. I want people, maybe it's my ego, but it's also the teacher in me. I want people to say, wow, that was amazing. I have never thought about it like that. Or that was so beautiful. I was weeping. You moved me. That's what I want. I don't want to hear it. That's really good, Rabbi. Nice sermon.
Yeah.
That to me is just awful. So I do extemporaneous speaking, of course, but not when I'm the darshan.
Yeah, that's the prime time slot. That's where you give everything you have.
That's right. And again, it goes back to, not only does Torah deserve that, but it's interesting when during Kriyat Torah, there's no sloppiness allowed. Obviously, if it's a 13-year-old, we correct and move on. But if your chazan at your shul is sloppy, they're gone. Why isn't that true for the rabbi as a preacher? It should be.
Right. You got to be professional.
You got to be professional. You got to be accurate. You got to be fair, b'shem omro. You have to quote Torah correctly. You have to read it correctly.
I noticed that you're very liberal with your pauses, which you really kind of extract all the emotion that you can out of a pause.
That's right, and it goes to the rhythm. Sometimes I'll speed up. Sometimes I'll slow down. Sometimes I'll take it one word at a time. And then the next. Now, you and I both know I have your attention in a way I didn't 30 seconds ago. I could see it on your face. So rhythm, look at act. It is acting to some degree, of course, because I already know what I'm going to say. So technically it's acting. And there's nothing wrong with that. If it successfully implants the story within the heart of the listener. That's the job.
Part 3. The myth of shrinking attention spans. Stop blaming the audience.
So let me talk to attention spans today, from when you started back in, was it 87?
87, yeah.
Yeah. So how do you obviously that people are much more distracted now, and you deal with something that we don't have to deal with, which is digital distractions on on a Sabbath morning. How do you manage that? How do you address that?
Well, we don't allow the digital distraction. That's the first thing. Is I have everyone take out their phones before we begin and turn them off. And if I see anybody on a phone during the service, I will literally say, and they'll put it away. So that helps. In terms of attention span, I think this attention span thing, these kids, TikTok and this and that. These are the same people who will binge watch The Sopranos in their cave of a den for hours or days. So I don't really buy the attention span as an issue. I think it's generally the poor quality of what you're asking people to sit still for.
Mm-hmm.
People have plenty of attention span for things that captivate them. They don't have any problem paying attention. They have a problem paying attention to something that is uninspiring. So just to get on the soapbox for a second, the real enemy of synagogue life in America, and I would say even Jewish life in America, outside of the Orthodox community, it is not intermarriage, although that is a threat. It's not the threat. It's not Jew hatred. It's boredom. That's the threat. That's the enemy. Boredom is the enemy of non-Orthodox American Judaism. Because when most people go to most Jewish institutions or organizations, most of the time, the person up there representing Judaism as peoplehood, as religion, as culture, have little or nothing to say, or have a lot of knowledge, but aren't able to communicate it in a meaningful way that captivates people. So I often say to our staff, and we have a very large community, Never blame the customer. Oh, their attention span, they can't. Don't blame the customer. It's not their fault. They are not interested. It's your fault.
Yeah, it's like a comedian trying to blame the audience for not getting a reaction.
Oh, that's the great thing about being a stand-up comic. If you fail, at least no one laughs at you.
Right.
Hey there, fellow podcast listeners. Are you enjoying the show so far? I hope you're finding value in all the insightful conversations coming your way, and I'm grateful for all the time we get to spend together. Now, I have a small favor to ask, one that can make a big difference. Your feedback is invaluable to me. By taking a moment to rate and review this podcast, you're not only showing your support, but also helping it reach new heights. Picture this: more reviews means more visibility. More visibility means more incredible guests lining up to share their stories and expertise with you. So, if you're enjoying what you're hearing, how about making some magic happen? Scroll down, tap that rating, jot down a few words. It's that simple. Your action today can pave the way for even greater experiences tomorrow. Thanks for your support. Now let's get back to the program.
Part 4. The role of congregational leaders today.
So I want to segue into a quote from Jerry Seinfeld, because I think it's very apropos to what you speak about, which is, he said that he talks about pain. He says, pain is knowledge rushing in to fill a void. Where he says that, previously, you didn't know that there was a doorpost, a bedpost there, and you trip over it. Now you know it, that it fills in information, missing information. And I know you talk a lot about, especially in your book, about suffering. There's no shortcut to the knowledge and the wisdom that suffering can impart.
There's no shortcut, but there is context, which I think is very helpful. I think it's very helpful for Jews when we remind them that what's happening in Gaza and what happened on October 7th is a new chapter. It's not a new reality. It's a new chapter in a very old story. And while this is the wake-up call for this generation, it can be very helpful and instructive even to look at other wake-up calls throughout history as both a reassuring sense that Gamze Yavor, and we do normalize things, and we do reach a level of stasis. And very helpful to feel less alone. And there's a set of tools bequeathed to us by generations past to help us manage these sorts of crises and challenges. So let's not even deal with October 7th. Let's talk about COVID. I was able to get up, and I'm obviously paraphrasing because I try to be elegant and write these things down, but I'm able to get up and talk about the Unatana Tokef and say, we're not the first people to live through a plague. Let's look at how they suggested we go about this. Right?
Yeah.
Some tshuva, some tefillah, some tzedakah, right? Let's tend to our relationships. Let's lean on each other, care about each other. And let's tend to our inner spiritual lives. And let's be generous and help each other. That's the way to live through a plague. So people find that, and I find that very comforting. I fall in love again and again and again with the wisdom of the martyrs who came before us and the sufferers who came before us. There's a lot to learn from Job theologically. There's a lot to learn from the failure of his friends to be his friends, to show up without judgment. So context here, which is a dirty word in the context of what's happening in Israel and Gaza. However, as a preacher, it's very important. Let's look at what the New York Times said about the Kishinev pogrom in 1903. Right? And let's think about how we responded to that and how we might do that differently today. So I think that I would put this conversation about the lessons that pain comes to teach us under the general rubric of the idea, which is what I know I really talk about ultimately, is that ultimately Torah is about the human condition. And while not saying it quite so overtly generally, the way I would put that also is, you think you have modern problems. There are no modern problems. The human condition hasn't changed in 3,000 years. And we have both the accrued and the distillate of the wisdom of those who came before us. And if you can be a conduit between modernity and what people believe are modern problems, and connect them to this ancient wisdom, which really is timeless, not ancient, now you've got something. Now you are engaging people with their faith, whether they realized it before or not. You know this. There's nothing that your predecessors and mine did not think through very deeply about being a human being. Nothing. There is no aspect they didn't touch. So pain is one of them. And yes, pain is the great teacher. You have to be disrupted to learn. You only learn through disruption. Marshall McLuhan, one of my favorites, he said, I don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't the fish.
I love it.
Think about it. It's really God's answer to Job, isn't it? Who are you? You don't have my perspective. You're only human. You can only know so much. You're born in water, live in water, die in water. You have no idea you're in water. I will tell you about water. Okay? Or you will discover water when you're jerked out of it, wriggling in pain at the end of a hook, gasping for air. That's when the fish discovers water. That's when human beings discover God. That's when human beings discover the power of showing up, of compassion, of time, of nature, of prayer. That's when it happens, when you disrupt the equilibrium of life. Now, there are also very beautiful and positive disruptions. It's a boy. That disrupts your life. How many kids do you have?
We had 4, and the oldest is 20. And now we just had one. I just turned 50 this year. We just had a kid. Crazy.
You had a kid at 50?
At 50, yeah. She's 8 months old.
So I'm guessing it's disruptive.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And exquisite.
Exactly.
So disruptions are not always like an asteroid hitting the earth and wiping out the dinosaurs. They're not always destructive. But it's the disruptive part by which we learn. I think that's why you study, in a chavruta. I think that's why Barzel mechaded Barzel. You only learn from being awakened to life.
Part 5. A good rabbi is an authentic actor.
So I'm curious, it sounds like the impetus for the book was you had an accident. You were involved in an accident.
You're talking about the More Beautiful Than Before?
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Yes.
And that taught you, from what I was able to glean from the press that you've done, it taught you empathy. It taught you to be kinder. It taught you to be more of a listener, these types of things. What about the young rabbi, the young congregational leader who does not have the pain, those years, the maturity? How did they relate to the older congregants?
Well, I think I've always been able to do it, honestly. I started it, they hired me when I was 26. So the way, again, and I guess this goes all the way back to Sandy Merenson and reading plays, you can move people through other people's experiences, not necessarily your own, but you have to curate it really well. Can't be gratuitous. It can't be overused. It has to be relatively, I don't know what the word is, relatively surprising to people. Like, oh, everybody knows that one. No, you don't want that. But look, if you can't talk about having a kid at 50, you can certainly call a rabbi I know and ask about it and say, I asked this question and let me tell you what I learned. So I think which goes back to, I think, an important fundamental we haven't talked about yet, which is authenticity. If I were a 27-year-old rabbi and I wanted to write about a child in your old age, not that 50 is old, but if I wanted to sort of talk about Abraham and Sarah in some way, right, I might call you and say, Daniel, let me ask you something. Is the joy of a baby at 50 different than the joy of a baby at 30? Right? So you have to be authentic, which means stay in your lane. Don't pretend you're 50 and had a baby. You won't pull it off. You can't. It's phony. It's inauthentic. Yes. And people know that. So you've got to rely on becoming then a storyteller of other people's stories. By the way, nobody wants to sit there and listen to you talk about your own life all the time. Because first of all, a rabbi can only be so authentic. You have to pull some punches. You have to. I remember saying to my psychiatrist years ago, I said, I feel like the moment I step out my front door, I'm acting. All day, every day. And he looked at me and said, well, you are. And I thought to myself, wait a minute. It's okay? Aren't I a phony? I mean, I have all of this imposter syndrome anxiety. He said, no, you're not a phony. People need you to act. You're playing a role that people need and want you to play. Now, you're playing it with as much authenticity and ability as you can, but you can't just walk around imploding the mythology. That's not helping people. So I realize like the authenticity and performance are not necessarily antithetical. And also a rabbi can only be authentic to a point, or it becomes gratuitous or boring, or you become a one-trick pony. Oh, here he goes with the how he met his wife story again. Right? You don't want to do that. So I would say to the younger rabbis, if you want to write about something that is completely outside of your lane, find the best and the brightest in that lane and quote them. Who cares? But the opposite is terrible, to be, pretend you know something you don't. I mean, anytime I hear a priest talk, I'll give you an example, and this is going to sound sort of, I don't know, not the most ecumenical of all statements I've ever made, but I was doing a wedding recently, and the chaplain of the high school where the kids met was there, Catholic priest. Kids are Jews, but they went to this high school and they met because of this chaplain, etc. He was there. So during my drush, I was asking people to raise their hands if they've been married 1 to 10 years, 11 to 20, and when I said something like 21 to 30, he raised his hand because he's obviously, he's married to the church. And I thought to myself, no, you're not. You don't know anything about marriage. Put your hand down. Like, what you're going to tell me about marriage? No, you're not. And you never want to evoke that feeling in the listener. In shul, like, oh, the 27-year-old rabbi is going to tell me about parenting? Shut up. You don't want to do that. So you want to quote the sources, right? And I'll tell you something else I think is very helpful structurally. The classic structure of Midrash is mashal nimshal. But when you're talking to a relatively illiterate group of Jews, Jewishly illiterate, they could be neurosurgeons, but don't really know Torah all that well. I have found you have to reverse it. You have to start with the nimshal, which is more familiar to them than the mashal, and then you go to the mashal. Then I almost never start with the text. I lead to the text and create the connection, beginning with something more relatable. And I'll use a transition sentence like, this is an old story, but I'll bet most of us here don't realize how old. So maybe I start talking about my dad and my Uncle Mort, who my father only referred to as that schmuck, and their business together running Leder Brothers Metal, and what it did to their relationship, and the parental favoritism, and the misery, the multi-generational misery in our family. And then I'll say, this is a story from my childhood 60 years ago, and it's an old story. But this is an even older story than most of us here know. And then I may talk about, Yaakov. And I may talk about Joseph and his brothers. I don't know where I'm going to go, depends on part. But you see how it's a reversal of the midrashic rhetorical strategy.
Yeah, that seems super effective.
And that's just knowing your audience.
Part 6. Securing the future of Jewish leadership. Lessons from the former Soviet Union.
What has changed in from back when you were studying and even teaching and nowadays? What are the schools producing, and what do people need?
I have a policy of not criticizing Jewish institutions publicly in the press or any form of media. So let me answer your question by saying I have nothing to say about the seminaries that would not force me to abrogate that policy. Nothing. And you might go back to earlier when I mentioned the real enemy of Jewish continuity in America.
The boredom, not inspiration.
If I had another life ahead of me or another career ahead of me, and I don't, but if I was at the point where I am today in terms of accomplishing what I've hoped to accomplish in my shul and putting it on its feet and handing it over, if I was 10 years younger, I would take over the seminaries if I could, or I'd start my own. Because, I had the head of a movie studio say to me one time, Steve, it always comes down to talent. Whatever you see that's successful or not, ultimately, it's because of talent or a lack thereof. It all comes down to talent. So we need really talented rabbis and educators and chazanim, or we're finished. I don't care how pretty your building is. I don't care how good your location is. I don't care how good your parking is. I don't care, how wonderful the bar mitzvah tutor was for Shmulik. None of that matters if there isn't real talent at the top. That's why most synagogues are circling the drain. And I'm not going to make friends by saying this, but the emperor has no clothes. We have to talk about it. I pulled our congregation out of the URJ 15 years ago. We have to be honest with ourselves and find a way to recruit and support the very, very best in Bryce. You know, I was in the Soviet Union in the late 80s, and it was really grim. It was the era of Brezhnev, Kosygin, and Podgorny. It was awful. Okay, there were fish heads and black bread in the grocery store. I didn't see a fresh green vegetable for the entire time I was there, or a decent piece of fruit. Snow was being cleared by elderly women with brooms. The stoplights were run by hand. But they had a world-class gold medal gymnastics team. Now, how is that possible? It's possible because they identified the very best, the 10 very best 5-year-olds in the entire country, and they put them into a special program, and they poured resources into them, and they were world class. Why is it we don't do that with rabbis? Why is it that the seminaries don't call me and don't call you and say, hey, guys, listen, we want your single best bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah of the year. You get one, the best, the kid that you know has it. Because we want to take that kid and we want to put them all in a special program. They're going to be 12 of them or 20 of them, and we're going to groom them. And I was groomed for the rabbinate since I was 15 years old. The rabbis at camp, they saw me and they groomed me. And I'm glad they did, because it's a good marriage that I have with my role and my shul. So I think there's a lot that can be done. So, you know, in terms of what do people need, we can certainly talk about that, okay? People need rabbis who can connect them to their own inheritance in terms of all this wisdom. They need rabbis who can also build a business and run a business. You know, these rabbis say, I don't fundraise. That's not. You don't fundraise? You are responsible for feeding this family and you won't get a job? What's wrong with you? And by the way, you don't realize, Lamisha yesh mea, yesh lo dea. Come on. Don't be an idiot. Well, I don't, preaching, I hardly ever do it. So, you know, I do Dvar Torah. I talk about it. I do blah, blah, blah. I play games. Really? Do you not understand that that's how you're going to be judged? By almost everyone. You know, I'm not a great writer. I don't write things out. I just bullet points. Really? You're not going to invest the discipline? What would you think if the Rambam had done that? You wouldn't even know who he was if he gave us bullet points. So come on, you know, reach, stretch, be authentic and creative and work tirelessly. You know, when I taught at the seminary, there were always students who would give me in one way or another but what about my Shabbat? And I was like, you don't get one. This is jihad. This is holy war, and we're losing. We're losing. So if you're here for your own self above the selflessness required to lead a community, you're in the wrong place. Stay in the yeshiva. So, you know, it's a lot of things, Daniel, that are missing, that are necessary. It worries me. We just went through a search and we're going through another search. We have a pretty big staff, and so we're hiring rabbis a lot. It's rough out there. And my colleagues say the same. There's not a lot of talent. And look, there are a lot of reasons for that, and some of them beyond our control. And some of them are good reasons. Smart Jewish kids can run movie studios and hedge funds and get into law school and medical school, and they can do whatever they want now. So yeah, there's competition. But I go back to the Soviet Union model. There's still 20 rock stars every year coming out of our synagogues in America. Rock stars. We're just not paying attention.
Yeah. So in closing, what would your pitch be to if you spotted a young, hot, rising star? How would you pitch him on the rabbinate?
By the way, spotting is the first thing. A friend of mine started Soul Cycle, and she considered herself a casting director. She said I had to have the right instructors in the right locations. The instructor that's right for Brooklyn is not the instructor that's right for Omaha. So I would go to acting schools and literally recruit actors. I'm a casting director. So your first point is the first point. Be where the talent is. Go to the high school musical, go to the debate team, call your rabbi, call the rabbis and say, come on, who's your best? So be looking for talent, number one. And number two, I would put up billboards in the 5 most populous Jewish cities in America that say something like this. Now, what I'm about to say is going to be very controversial, but no, I'm not going to, I don't want to do that. I don't want to throw a bomb. I would say this. Are you Jewish? Big question mark. Would you like deeply meaningful work? Question mark. Mid 6-figure income. Great tax advantages. Call this number. Because there's a negative narrative that's been developed about the rabbinate. I've been to one rabbinical convention, one CCR convention in 1988, and I haven't gone back since. Why? Because you know what it was mostly? A bunch of people bitching about being rabbis. And their board and their president and their contract and their this and their that. Poor me. I couldn't take it. There's such a negative narrative about the rabbinate. So I would also take 2 or 3 rabbis who really love their work, and I'd put them on the road at every important Jewish summer camp in Hillel in America to talk about how great their life is. I don't know a lawyer who wouldn't trade places with me if they really knew how fulfilling my job is. I don't know any happy lawyers. Do you? I really don't. So I know successful lawyers. I don't know many happy lawyers. I don't know many happy doctors anymore either. So the potential's out there, but I do think it's recruitment, it's changing the narrative, and it means also being willing to have empty desks if you can't find the right 20 to go in each year. Where is it written you have to take a bunch of people to fill the desks who really, are going to be mediocre or worse when they get out? Don't do that.
Don't settle.
Don't settle. If you can find 5 great candidates that year, take the 5. Don't allow anything less than our best to be given the keys to drive the next generation forward. It's going to kill us. It's already killing us. How many synagogues do you know that are growing outside of the Orthodox community? Very few.
Mm-hmm.
And half of them that say they are probably not.
Yeah. I know your time's valuable, and it's Friday.
I've got about 2 minutes.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, let me ask you the last question. The most important one first is, who should I speak to next? That's what I ask at the end of every interview. That's how David Wolpe brought me to you.
I wish I could tell you. First of all, let's be honest. I don't get out much. I'm on the Bima, and I've been in one place for 37 years.
Yeah.
So I don't get out much. But I haven't been deeply moved by anything I've seen lately. So And I will also say this. You might want to consider you might want to consider great communicators and orators outside of the rabbinate,
Yeah.
because your listeners may learn more from the outside. I don't hang out with other rabbis because my problems are not the same as theirs. And I look outside of the synagogue and organized Jewish world for solutions to our institutional problems. If I need to build a building, I'm going to the head of the museum who just built the most incredible building I've ever seen in my life. I'm not going to somebody that just put up a social hall that, behind the Beit Knesset. I'm not, and it looks like, it's got a door that folds open for when I'm not doing that. So I would say to you, like, start looking at other forms of preaching. Like, there's an amazing book I read many years ago. It was called I don't even remember the author's name, The Art of the Southern Folk Preacher. And that's where I learned about refrains, landing places for the ear and the heart and the mind. So you might consider just talking to great speakers and preachers. In terms of rabbis, honestly, I can't tell you because I don't listen much to other rabbis and I don't get out much. And the rabbis who did influence me are dead, sadly.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. The only question I was going to ask you, and if you don't have time to answer it, that's fine, which is, how did the advent of streaming and capturing your sermons change the way that you deliver it, or has it?
It hasn't, because when I started in 1987, we recorded them on cassettes. And my drive home from shul, every Shabbat morning, I would listen to the sermon I had just given. And I would learn from the mistakes, the times I didn't land the line properly, the joke that didn't quite work or wasn't 1,000% on point, or this was a little too long, or, that sentence sounded an awful lot like the one before it. So I would apply my much of what I learned, by the way, as an undergraduate, to what I had just delivered and what I was now experiencing in the car on the way home. So for me, it hasn't changed because I've always watched myself and listened to myself, always.
But do you feel that you're speaking to more people now than are gathered in the room in that regard?
Look, there is, other than publishing a book, and even then, to have 40, 50,000 followers, come on. Nobody had that instantly the way we do now. So yeah, I'm not telling you it hasn't made a difference, but when it comes to, has it affected my preaching style or how I do, not really, because I've always paid attention to the point of view of the audience. And I'm calling it an audience deliberately. We know it's a kahal, but I'm calling it an audience because it's not just a congregation. They're also exposed to presentations all the time. So look, I learned from watching TED Talks, for example. I've learned a lot watching. Now, I haven't watched a TED Talk in about 5 years or more because I think I got it. Like the way, not the content, but the kind of aesthetic of it and structurally how they operate. So we've got to constantly be looking outside ourselves for not Chomer Ladrush, although that for sure, but also just who's really great at this. Who are the great communicators? And by the way, even, and I have to be honest, because like I don't even think it's arrogant. I really believe this. When I hear, oh, have you ever heard so-and-so? She's awesome, or he's a great communicator. I look at him, he's good. I don't think he's great. There's not a lot of great. If you find some, watch it and learn everything you can.
Yeah.
So I would say to you, why is it only rabbis you're talking to?
Yeah, I've actually spoken to some comedians, and I tend to speak to some speechwriters, and really people who are tasked with transforming an audience, like you're saying.
Have you? Yeah, and talk to some black preachers, but get to someone who is gifted in both worlds. Like, they can structure things, but they can also improvise. almost jazz, refrain, improv, refrain, improv, refrain. That's generally the structure anyway. Their use of source material, etc. So I think there's a lot to learn from a lot of different people,
Yeah.
including, yes, comedians, because comedy is mostly timing. Do everything you can to be as great as you can, but approach it as the art and craft and science that it is. Take it seriously, which does not mean when you preach you need to be serious all the time, but take it seriously.
Where can I point people to your
Instagram is always good.
Yeah.
And probably YouTube, but wbtla.org. A lot of stuff is archived on the synagogue's website, and there's a lot of stuff on Instagram. Those are my two main. I just don't have time to do more. So
Yeah. And your books are all on.
Books are all on Amazon.
Okay. And you have a personal website that
I do. I don't really feed it often, but there's some interesting stuff on there.
Okay, wonderful. I'm looking forward to hearing great things from you and your extended retirement.
Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom to you.
Okay, we'll be back in touch soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to The Maggid Method, and I'm Daniel Steinberg. Learn more about the Maggid Method at maggidmethod.com, maggidmethod.com. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.